Bojack to do a second interview since the ratings essentially saved their network. These boosts to Bojack's ego get the better of him, and he takes it too far. Despite Princess Carolyn's rightful objections, Bojack wants to do the interview. This clip perfectly represents the problem with Bojack's attitude, and the mental gymnastics he uses to justify putting himself back on that stage.
And if my openness and candor about addiction is helping people, then I'm kind of a dick if I don't do another interview, right?
And of course this would all come back to haunt him as the real, raw, emotional interview the world was promised was actually coming up shortly. But the first interview wasn't without some fallout. People like Paige Sinclair and Dr. Champ didn't take kindly to the softballed interview that left Bojack looking like the victim. And while it's definitely possible that the information they had on Bojack could have come out even without a second interview, it wouldn't have nearly been as effective in swaying public opinion as the second sit-down with William Pratt.
There's actually a better way to make money on Amazon other than Audible. It's Audible. If you don't know what Audible is,
armed with a fuller picture of Bojack's toxic history, Biscuits delivers an actual hard-hitting interview with Bojack, confronting him with parts of his past he wasn't expecting to talk about, including things that we as the audience were unaware of. The biggest of these is, of course, the damning revelation that Bojack not only carefully called himself to Sarah Lynn's phone to lie to the police, but he waited 17 minutes to call an ambulance to come and get her. Sarah Lynn would end up dying at the hospital, and we as the audience are forever left with the haunting question: could Bojack have saved Sarah Lynn if he wasn't so selfish? Biscuits then starts to lay out some of the things we do know about Bojack, and while we as the audience have seen these things played out from Bojack's perspective over the course of many episodes, every single thing out below does paint an important picture. I've seen a lot of fans of this show talk about how dirty this was of Biscuits, how it was wrong and manipulated the truth, but I think they're really missing the point, especially given the context of the situation. Biscuits is a journalist. She was presented with credible allegations that paint a troubling pattern. To ignore this pattern would have been legitimately immoral. Now we as the audience, of course, have a fuller picture of some of these things because the show literally follows Bojack. But we cannot and should not expect other characters to have the same picture we do. We know, for instance, that an accusation like this...
did you help a teen mom get a rehab and take her to a high school party?
...isn't fully accurate. We saw exactly what went down. We know that Bojack was actually trying to help kids. But we also know that accusations like this...
Take a high school girl to her party.
...actually are much worse. Double-edged sword. And though we also recognize that Bojack's power differential in his hookups and relationships might have been subconscious, we have to recognize that they exist, and that Bojack has not done himself any favors when exercising the power he holds over people. But I think that the actual most important thing about this second interview with Braxby, and the thing that made the biggest difference in the eyes of the public, was Bojack's behavior. This was the interview where we were given what the first one promised, the real Bojack Horseman. Without the careful and meticulous planning to help Bojack avoid looking bad, Bojack showed his true colors. Bojack could have held himself accountable and recognized that he did hold power over people, but instead, he got defensive. He argued. He was aggressive.
We're all a bunch of stupid, hungry, horny little dudes just grabbing at shit, hoping it'll press that little button in our brain that says, okay, you're happy now.
Bojack was definitely being honest here. This doesn't paint a picture of somebody who is remorseful for his mistakes. Having fallen back into his old patterns, Bojack was no longer relatable, and he's losing the sympathy that he built up in the first interview. And then comes the big bombshells with Sarah Lynn. This confronts Bojack about the situation on Horse and Around with Sharona, when Sarah Lynn got drunk on Bojack's vodka.
Sharona was a drunk too, so you can't trust the things she says. Obviously, she has a vendetta against me. Besides, I already apologized to her.
Apologize for what?
Bojack continues his defensive streak. He flounders. He starts to throw other people under the bus. He is completely relapsed into his old ways. And then he reveals a non-public piece of information that we as the audience knew, but something I think the audience is all too often let slide.
I didn't even have sex with her until she was 30.
This wasn't even an allegation. It was a full admission to the public. Bojack had hooked up with his literal television daughter. Sarah Lynn was beloved by the world. This was the final straw for Bojack's image. It was irredeemable, especially when you take into account the indefensible fact that he might have been able to save her life. Bojack wanders around LA after his interview, waiting for his life to change forever, he stumbles upon the Laugh Shack, where he used to perform. He finds an outline of his younger self on the back wall, and we see a flashback to Bojack and Herb in the 80s, before fame changed him. The pre-horsing around Bojack is always such a far cry from the character we followed for 6 years. There's actual enthusiasm in his voice when he learns he gets to do a screen test. We see a young man dreaming of a bigger life, of stardom and fame, if only he knew. Herb finishes outlining Bojack in whiteout and says this.
This way, you'll always be immortalized and undisturbed in Hollywood forever.
Bojack would be immortalized in Hollywood forever for the ways he hurt and abused people, but there would also always be this reminder here on the Laugh Shack, an outline of who Bojack was before fame changed him, before he became the person we know. Can we blame all of Bojack's mistakes on fame? No, of course not. But we also can't ignore the ways that fame, fortune, and power can change a person. But the next sequence is also a reminder that with fame and power can come important responsibility. The horse who runs the show at the last chapter of Bojack, how much horsing around meant to his brother, how important it was to him before he succumbed to his own addiction.
Now, anytime I hear anything about that show, I hear my brother's laugh. Thanks for that.
We see throughout the show that through horsing around, Bojack did have a positive impact on many people's lives. Whether it's Mr. Peanut Butter, who scored a big break because another network wanted to rip horsing around off, or Diane, who related to horsing around and watching in a broken home. Bojack did have positive impacts on people through his work. And when he made all of these terrible, toxic, abusive decisions, there are massive ripple effects. It doesn't just affect the people he hurt specifically, or his friends, or his own livelihood. It affects the many people who look to his show for comfort. In those last few minutes, before Bojack is truly immortalized forever, he decides to do stand-up one last time. Something that we saw him say in the flashback that he was looking forward to not having to do ever again. He recognized that this would be the final time he'd get on a stage and embrace what he used to be, what could have been.
Meet your next pillow. Why do we make our pillow in the shape of a cube? I'll tell you. The problem with pillows is that
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting aspects of Bojack's disastrous interview was seeing exactly how those closest to him reacted, namely Princess Carolyn, Todd, and Diane. In the immediate aftermath of the interview, you can tell that Princess Carolyn was struggling. She knew that not only Bojack's life, but her entire life was about to change. She could have gone with Bojack to grab tacos and comfort him in his last few hours of freedom, which is something that the old Princess Carolyn definitely would have done, but she didn't.
I think you have 3 hours before this interview airs and your world changes.
As the interview airs, we see Princess Carolyn arrive home. She doesn't turn on the TV to watch it unfold. She sits down with Judah and plays with Ruthie. This sequence shows that while this is incredibly hard on Princess Carolyn, she has to accept that everything is going to change and embrace her own future. She can't keep holding on to Bojack, even if it hurts. She has her own life and family to worry about. It's difficult, but it's the right thing for her to do. Similarly, we see Todd sitting with Maud, watching TV. Maud asks Todd if he wants to watch the Bojack interview, and he says he doesn't think he wants to. This decision specifically leads to Maud asking about Todd finding his own place.
Landed at his house one night.
You ever get tired of living at the mercy of whoever happens to let you crash on their couch?
After this, the two of them decide to move in together. Since the show started, we've never seen Todd even consider this. He's always crashed or lived with another character. But this decision to not watch the Bojack interview is a metaphor for him moving on from Bojack and this part of his life. Todd is ready to move up and move on. It's time as Bojack steps down. Diane, on the other hand, can't help herself. Where PC and Todd don't watch the interview, Diane does. You can tell she was trying to avoid it, but she isn't ready to move on from Bojack yet. While watching, Bojack says something that bothers her, and she nearly turns it off. But then, he says something that she understands, that she relates to, that she empathizes with, and she just feels sad for him again. This metaphorically leaves the door open in her relationship with Bojack. She still isn't ready to say goodbye, and sadly, this would come back to haunt her later. These decisions are reflected in the series finale, Nice While It Lasted. PC and Todd are friendly and even reminiscent with Bojack. They can't deny their relationship with him entirely, but you can also tell that they've both moved on from him. Sure, Todd will give Bojack some advice and share a moment with him, but he isn't going to have the same type of relationship with him anymore. Ditto for Princess Carolyn, who was revealed did not invite Bojack to her friend's family wedding, or the industry wedding. She even tells Bojack that she'll recommend representation for him when he gets out of prison. She'll be there for him, but she isn't going to work with him anymore. Not personally. She's moved on. But Bojack's final conversation with Diane reveals the ways that their continued relationship after Xerox of the Xerox had profoundly negative effects on her. The voicemail he left on her phone during View from Halfway Down haunted her and had rippling effects throughout her life. Rippling effects that she had to overcome because she left that door open rather than move on right after the second interview. she wasn't going to let that happen again.
By the car! I don't believe in rock bottom.
Bojack's words in the first interview with Biscuit would actually end up being prophetic. He would soon hit the rockiest bottom he's ever hit, really changed his life. The way Bojack is structured is that throughout all 6 seasons, we see massive highs and the lowest of lows. And while the events of the last 5 or 6 episodes of the show are difficult to stomach, I like to ask myself, what would have happened if he hadn't done the second interview? We can't know for sure, but do we know that Bojack would have left his life completely back on track? That he would have gone back to Wesleyan and completely overcome his toxic traits, his addictions, his fears, and his insecurities? Or would Bojack have found a different, rockier bottom somewhere else? Would Bojack's conscience or our experience through the story been better had Bojack not been held accountable for his actions? I don't think so. But I do know that BoJack Horseman is an optimistic show. We don't know what the future holds for Bojack after the series finale, but we do know that there's hope for him to be a better person, even if that doesn't mean redemption in the eyes of his friends or the public. And I think that had Bojack not done that second interview and survived this scandal unscathed, we wouldn't have had such a poignant and important message. It's hard not to think about Sarah Lynn through all of this. Even though she isn't actually in this episode, her presence is massive and important. I don't think anyone can argue that Bojack had negative intentions when it comes to Sarah Lynn. I believe him when he says this.
I love Sarah Lynn.
But I don't think you can ignore the way that his actions impacted her life. But even if you don't take into account Don't Stop Dancing, or the way he took advantage of her at her lowest point, or the fact that he interrupted her 9 months of sobriety so he could go on a bender to cope with his own insecurities, you can't ignore that final action. I titled my video about That's Too Much Man, Bojack's Most Selfish Act. And the truth is that this final decision was the culmination of that selfishness. Bojack loved Sarah Lynn, but that love still didn't outweigh his own fear of the repercussions of his own actions. He still put himself above this girl that he loved so much. And he sat in that parking lot for 17 minutes before he called the ambulance. Maybe it would have made a difference, maybe it wouldn't have. But if you need a reminder of just how long 17 minutes takes, just look at the time code of this video. That's too much, man. Thanks so much for tuning into another BoJack episode breakdown. Let me know which episode you want me to cover next. If you can, please do the whole liking and subscribing thing because it helps me out. And I'll see you next time. Peace. Good neighbor, State Farm is there. Always looking to get a quote today. Fears, insecurities, and it's the culmination of everything that defined him as a person. If you haven't seen the final 8 episodes of BoJack Horseman, this is your final spoiler warning. As I'm sure you know, this episode all takes place in BoJack's mind and the surrounding community. Through his near-death experience, BoJack goes on an existential exploration, accepting the life we live and our own mortality. BoJack walks up to what I believe should have been a for Beatrice. Notably, BoJack is shown up at the dinner party with Sarah Lynn's death. BoJack understandably blames himself for Sarah Lynn's death, and that's fully represented by the fact that he literally brought her to his afterlife party. The interior of the house merges many aspects of BoJack's life. We see paintings, furniture, and objects from his childhood home. The kitchen is mainly the one proportioned around, but it also contains aspects of his childhood kitchen. Throughout the episode, black tar drips from the ceiling, often onto Bojack himself, eventually chasing him. Back in season 1, Telescope, Charlotte talks about Los Angeles, how it's a flashy place that sits on top of all this black tar. But in season 2, Escape from LA, she amends her and tells Bojack that he's fun. It seems to have manifested itself as a unique threat throughout the dream. Eventually, it consumes everyone in his life, including himself. On arrival, Bojack gives his mother pink hydrangea. There's a lot of symbolism embedded in these flowers. In Japanese culture, hydrangeas are often associated with mythology. Subconsciously, Bojack still feels guilty for leaving Beatrice near before he dies. On top of this, pink hydrangeas tend to represent heartfelt emotion. This
Guilt and attempted apology is something Bojack genuinely feels in his heart. Other cultures have different beliefs about this flower. Victorians are known to feel negatively about hydrangeas. They represent boastfulness and vanity. These are also descriptors of Beatrice's lifestyle growing up. Historically, hydrangeas were given to people who turned down love interests, representing those people as cold and frigid. It's certainly a dated concept that also fits Beatrice's description. She is a cold and frigid character, particularly towards Bojack. Because of her pregnancy with Bojack, she turned down a potential love interest for Beatrice. Another interesting superstition about hydrangeas is that if they're planted near the front of your house, you might risk your daughter growing up to be a spinster, which is another dated term for an elderly, unmarried woman. Beatrice ends up leaving the hydrangeas in front of the house, and after Bojack's car takes her to them, they grow large and obstruct the exit, trapping everyone inside. While Beatrice did end up marrying Butterscotch, I think she often felt like a spinster. She was trapped in a marriage she didn't actually want, felt like life and opportunity passed by. This final hydrangea observation may be a stretch, but it's interesting to note that in order for hydrangeas to grow and become leaves, they must be planted in alkali. Alkali is a chemical compound that typically grows, perhaps a metaphor for Beatrice's attitude towards Bojack and the effect she had on his life. In the living room, there are an array of paintings.
Strap her! Get out!
Bojack's family portrait.
Don't let her escape!
There's a photo of Bojack's family at the lake house, the portrait of Cracker Jack, and a framed photo establishing the house portrait around him. There's even a silhouette portrait of Bojack, Butterscotch, and Beatrice in his childhood home. These are obviously images that represent many aspects of Bojack's life. Beatrice's broken family, how Bojack himself was raised. Cracker Jack was immortalized and put on a pedestal so that Bojack
Release
never
me.
loved him. Bojack's family life growing up.
Get on!
Come to some of the more interesting things. There's of course the hockey that we see in Bojack's house. But this time, Bojack is grounded in school. Bobby's foreshadow is what actually happened in this episode. But in addition to this, we see Joseph Sugarman's opening Beatrice to Bojack after Joseph's death. This is one of the few things that Beatrice passed down to grandfather. And while he did make it in his house, he didn't take great care of it. One we see at Sarah Lynn's house party guest actually drove holes. Later in the episode, when Bojack trying to escape, we see those same holes drilled through the painting again. Now, I think the actual most interesting painting is the one we don't see until Bojack is trying to escape. Here on the wall is a young horse who looks very much like Bojack, crying while holding clown hats. This was a painting we saw in Bojack's childhood home before Butterscotch accepted a job with the Sugarman. This image absolutely represents Bojack and the attitude that Beatrice instilled in him as a child. When Bojack was sad or upset, he used performance as a coping mechanism. He was a clown, a jester, and those things were fueled by pain and insecurity. The painting sits on the wall, it stretches and grows before revealing the pathway to the kitchen for horses around. This fully represents how this aspect of Bojack's personality led into his life as a sitcom star, and it's brilliantly showcased in the literal doorway to the sitcom house. As Beatrice and Bojack walk into the living room, Beatrice remarks that a bird flew into the house through the window, and they're trying to chase it out. There's a lot to unpack in regards to the bird. For one, a known superstition about birds flying into houses is that they're meant to foretell an important message. But if that bird died while still in the house, it foretells death. Other Celtic superstitions associate birds flying into houses with death as well. And though Bojack was able to chase the bird out of the house initially, he's later seen stuck within the house and dies before it's able to fly out. I think that it's possible there's even more to the novel. The bird's beak suggests that the novel Siddhartha, a songbird is present in the dream, much like this very episode. In Siddhartha, the songbird is dying in a golden cage, which is a symbolism of the character imprisoned in a world of wealth and luxury. The bird is effectively a world of luxury. Siddhartha's spiritual life is dying because of the world of life. And I don't know if it's more perfectly described in Bojack Horseman as a person. Exploring the themes in Siddhartha relates even further to the ideas found in this episode. The word Siddhartha roughly translates to each people is found meaning of existence, and the book philosophically explores what makes a meaningful life. This question is pretty directly debated at the dinner table, which brings us to our dinner guests. The first guest we see is Sarah. When they arrive, she's the cute little 3-year-old we know from the Horse and Around days. The longer they spend in the house, the more we see her grow up. Bojack knew Sarah Lynn at every stage of her life. They worked together on Horse and Around for 9 seasons and maintained a friendship up until the end. She grows up throughout the screen. Herb is wearing the same outfit he wore when he told Bojack he was going to star in Horse and Around, a pretty important moment in Bojack and Herb's relationship. And their attitude towards each other seems to be filled with camaraderie. There's even a sequence where they perform a bit together about asking the question, "Can I ask a question?" It feels remarkably similar to a flashback scene from The Telescope when they comedically complain explain about the phrase, here's the thing.
Just say the thing. You don't need to introduce the concept that there's going to be a thing.
Corduroy Jackson Jackson is wearing the outfit we saw him in when me and Bojack was boxed with autoerotic asphyxiation. And but when he died back in 2004, he was wearing a tux mystery and buttered black tie. Cracker Jack is wearing some army uniform. Bojack grew up seeing photos of corpses of his dad. Beatrice is wearing the outfit she wore to her debutante ball the same night she met Butterscotch when Bojack was deceased. While at the table, Beatrice asks Bojack if he's going to sing the Lollipop song in the show, which is a callback to this sequence from Downer Ending.
You go out there and you
There
do
you
the only
are.
thing you're good for, which is singing that goddamn lollipop song.
The last arrival to the party is Butterscotch, who in Bojack's first secretary. Given that Butterscotch wasn't around or his father Bojack, Bojack basically became secretary as a role model for his father. Each character is also something that in some way related to his death. Bojack deserved pills, Corduroy the lemon he would bite down on when autoerotic asphyxiating himself, Herb ate peanuts, which he was allergic to and ultimately caused his death. Beatrice has an unappetizing cafeteria-style spread by a nursing home. Cracker Jack a can of rashes food in the war. Sarah Lynn is eating a fast food burger and fries. Some people speculate this was the last food she ate on the Senate of Bojack. Secretariat is eating 2 eggs and whiskey coffee, which I think may have actually been Butterscotch's last. The only time we saw Butterscotch eat breakfast, he was served an omelet, and we know he liked Jack, so this lines up pretty well.
It was nothing.
The dinner starts out with the guests playing sequel, best part, worst part, and this really begins to get to the core of the existential questions this episode has. The characters talk about the best and worst parts of their lives. It evolves into a conversation about what makes life meaningful. It raises important philosophical questions like, is sacrifice inherently good? Is bringing joy to others through art and media important? Is authenticity? Do you get joy out of the things you do? Are they actually selfish? These questions are all intelligently explored through the characters who properly represent them, all while Bojack explores into his life was ultimately really meaningful. The joy he brought to others through his work, the help he gave people after rehabilitation, the friendships and bonds he formed, the fun and excitement he experienced, his own suffering and sacrifice. Do these things outweigh the pain and toxicity he otherwise brought into the world? And are any one of those things key to meaningful existence? This brings us back to the themes of Siddhartha, which very much grapple with these big picture life questions. Ultimately, the book determines that there isn't one specific aspect of life that makes it. Rather, it's a combination of all life has to offer that helps you attain understanding. This also ties into the larger themes of the final 8 episodes of Bojack. We see Diane grapple with these same ideas in Good Damn It, repeat them again in Nice Smaller Glasses. We even see it in action in Xerox and Xerox. Protestants and Carolyn struggle with their complicated relationships with Bojack, but ultimately their reflection on that relationship leads them to a greater understanding of what they want in life. He's genuinely happy to be with those who are most important to him and see him do that. Todd's reflections help him decide that moving into his own place with Maud is the best way to move forward in his life. Their past experiences help determine his trajectory. I think the most interesting thing about this dinner conversation is that we know the entire episode takes place in Bojack's mind. The questions that all of these characters pose also reflect different aspects of Bojack himself. It simultaneously explores all of the characters who have passed on and Bojack. When Secretariat shows up, the conversation turns to suicide. Herb admits he considered killing himself after inspiring him to look around. Ultimately, Herb continues to fight simple reasons to stay on Earth. The Secretariat criticizes him for lack of follow-through, but relishes his own decision to end life on his own. To me, it's still a question of Bojack. Back in season 3, he let go of the wheel of his car on the highway and also drove that same car into his school. Then in season 6, he goes swimming while this very episode. In the highway incident, he gives himself leeway to change his mind, and ultimately he does. He doesn't choose a method that would end his life as painful. Both school incidents, he gives himself further out. He drives his car into school during a huge party, and it would be expected for somebody to pull him out of school. When he goes drunk swimming, he calls Diane, effectively begging her to tell him not to go swimming. In every perceived suicide attempt, Bojack seeks a way out. He isn't fully convinced. Herb's story seems to be Bojack acknowledging this about himself, while Secretariat seems to be him questioning if he's weak for not following through. Dinner finishes with Bojack finally giving his best.
Put eyes everywhere.
He's young, hanging with Herb, trying to figure out life. Bojack's best part was the time after his toxic childhood and before future toxic decisions that he played in his life. Before he started to make the kinds of mistakes that he could make back.
She's here!
Diamond Overclock is twice as absorbent, so you could use lead.
The event of the evening is, of course, the big show, where all of our dinner guests perform in honor of Bojack Horseman.
In that building!
Shows on Sarah Lynn's free live with no stop. The original version was, of course, played show stuff. For the performance, Sarah Lynn is wearing a variation of the outfit she wore at Bert's funeral. This one's sporting white flourishes, making it a little bit more angelic. This makes a lot of sense, as in a way, this entire episode is sort of a funeral for Bojack. The lyrics read, "Life is a never-ending show, except for the minor detail at the end. The overture of the lifetime, the show is short. Here we're talking family and friends. You run the race, you blur your lives, your face up sure to try and giant signs, 1,000 feet tall. Describes a celebrity like Bojack or Sarah Lynn, how they do their job and are put on a pedestal. And when you're thrust into the guy's entertainment, you're pressured to keep performing until you're dead. The second verse transitions into a remix/mashup with Sarah Lynn's song "Pretty Muppet," and speaks to legacy. Shows are a never-ending life, of course, a silhouette that stays when you're gone. What use is the struggle and the strife, of course, and your legacy is on. The idea that your art will outlive you is really interesting, especially in regards to your legacy. Sarah Lynn had toxic traits of behavior, and she died tragically young, but because of her death, her legacy shines a bright, positive light on her. Bojack has lived such a long life since his early success and completely tainted his legacy. He's grappling with the idea that if he hadn't gone on living, his legacy would have had a positive impact. He wouldn't have caused us to suffer. The chatter stops, the crowd departs, the needle drops, the music stops. A song you taught me when I was small. A song you taught me when I was small is directly referencing two things in Bojack Horseman. The obvious one is this art lesson Bojack gave Sarah Lynn when she was young.
You don't stop dancing, and you don't stop smiling, and you give those people what they want.
But interestingly, this exact same idea was hammered into Bojack by his own mother.
You guys
Another
are
straggler!
out there,
We
and
missed
they
one.
want to hear you.
These are essentially the same lessons. You perform until nobody wants to see you perform. And this lesson was incredibly detrimental to both Bojack and Sarah Lynn's development. Sarah Lynn ends her performance, falling through the door on stage, and disappearing. Next to the stage is corduroy Jackson Jackson, with an aerial dance on a ribbon, reflecting the light of the sky. It's short, but it's powerful, especially here where his body goes Next is Zach Braff. While this is mostly praised to laugh, I think some of the things he said are still relatively profound. Loss is a collaborative art between people who leave us and those who remain. Dance with the shadows of their actions. I think if we're feeling a significant amount of loss, a lot of what we do will be dictated by this feeling. If you're feeling a loss of a relationship or friendship, you might avoid things that remind you of those people. Then fall into the abyss is definitely plays a laugh. Got a chance to deal with his death. While the tongue twister is funny, I think we can all relate to the fear of leaving this world before we've accomplished the things we set out to do. While Zach Braff takes the stage, Bojack and Secretariat take a smoke break. The conversation returns to whether life has meaning or purpose, or if true peace is attainable. The Secretariat started life over again. He says he wouldn't care as much, because ultimately everyone ends up in the exact same place. And as we know, this means that Bojack is pondering this exact same question. Secretariat briefly transitions to Butterscotch. Tells Bojack that he really did care about Bojack's views. I think the saddest and most profound thing about this moment is that we don't actually know if Butterscotch felt this much. It's essentially how Bojack hopes his father felt about it. Bojack laments that they never had any conversations like this when he was alive. But, as we know, they never had any conversations like this at all. Next, we get to the titular View from Halfway Down, Secretariat's poem about jumping off the George Rogers Flushing Bridge. This poem obviously describes Secretariat's mindset as he jumped off that bridge, and how his perspective changed on the way down. The first verse describes the Secretariat's mindset as he prepares to jump. The second describes that shift in his perspective as he sees the water approaching. It's all okay, it would be, but you're not now halfway down. The third verse describes the last-minute flailing and thrashing with hope that will survive the fall. The final verse is all about that immense regret he feels now that now he wishes he'd known the view from halfway down before Secretariat
For he was redeemed in light of
this
her
line of thinking is reaffirmed by many people like this one. As many say that on their way down, they feel regret and hope to survive the fall. One of my favorite details about this sequence is how the door to the abyss actually chases the Secretariat. After the first verse, it's on the far side of the stage, and each subsequent verse is closer and closer, much like the water of the Secretariat itself. Secretariat's method of death wasn't instantaneous, but he also couldn't take it back, so we see his impending death approaching, even if he regrets his mistake. This performance is also reflective of Bojack's journey through his near-death experience. He just realized what exactly he was experiencing, recognizing that he might not be waking up. He's metaphorically halfway down, and subsequently starts to verbalize that same regret that Secretariat laid out in his poem. Final performance Cracker Jack. The interest of the ribbon Cracker Jack I will during the climax of the performance, now the hard time. After he performs says personality is the part. I think this is meant to represent that life itself is the hard part. Death. That's it. As she spins in the air, her ribbon wraps her in a cocoon. Cracker Jack ties the other end around his waist and goes to the door. The tar from the abyss seeps back up the ribbon, stains the ribbon, which then unravels entirely. It falls to the ground, then bolts to the door itself. This represents how Cracker Jack said his life. Subsequently, as we know, Cracker Jack died after their mother sugar entirely affecting his life. This is all very creatively represented by the unraveling ribbon of this round. Following their performance, Irving is Bojack himself, listing out all of his fears. Father to no one that we know of, crippling alcoholic, and a stupid piece of work. The last was obviously a reference to the season 4 episode of the same title, which showcases Bojack's insecurity monologue. He asks Herb if it's terrifying, and Herb says everything must come to an end before placing his hand in the door, showing that the darkness has turned into the same dripping tar from throughout the episode. Bojack says, "See you on the other side."
Oh, Bojack, no. There is no other side. This is it.
Bojack is all alone once again, a recurring event in his life, usually because of his own toxic behavior. He walks up for his final performance, but panics, running through the house, desperate to call Diane. As he runs, the tar chases him and begins oozing throughout the house. When he gets back to the living room, we see that even the paintings and photos of him are oozing tar, often very specifically from the image of Bojack himself, reinforcing that fear instilled in him by Charlotte. After the clown painting opens up into the horsing around picture, the bird tries to escape the window before being consumed by Bojack's tar. Final moment. Bojack grabs the phone and talks to Diane, begging her to save him. This is when he remembers what happened. Diane didn't pick up the phone. He quickly shifts from panic to calm. He slowly walks outside, looking over the bridge down into his own body. As he looks down, we see the cord to the phone is wrapped around his neck. A very deliberate image showing that Bojack twisted himself into this situation. He talks to Diane, but as we know, he's really just talking to himself. In his last moments, as he accepts his fate, he just wants to talk to Diane, his best friend. His conversation with her seems to stem from what they had back in season 2's episode Yes and. Diane was at her lowest point, crashing in Bojack's house for months. She says she wishes she could go home to Mr. Peanut Butter and not have to explain it.
I would just say, how was your day? I would just say,
In these last moments, Bojack just wants to ask Diane how she's doing and not have to explain it.
my day was good.
He just wants to be present with someone he cares about. As he listens to Diane, he lets the tar consume him, accepting his fate and accepting his mortality. As the screen goes to black, we hear the heart rate monitor flatline. But if we watch the credits in their entirety, we hear it start to beat once more, hinting that he hasn't quite met his ultimate fate. Bojack's journey through his near-death experience showcases him grappling with his past, meeting life, and his own mortality. Through this experience, Bojack comes to a greater understanding of himself and of what a meaningful life means for him. The important thing about this episode isn't that Bojack did or didn't die. The important thing is that Bojack accepted his own mortality. Bojack opened his eyes and took a peek at his own view from halfway down. Unlike Secretariat, Bojack survived and was given one more chance. Just maybe, this deeper understanding, Bojack is less selfish and more fulfilling. Hey, thank you all so much for tuning into this breakdown of Bojack Horseman season. Time Zero is one of the most unique episodes in all of BoJack Horseman, and it gives us some much-needed perspective on the life of Beatrice Horseman. Explored through her own dementia-riddled mind, this episode showcases all of the most important and affecting events of Beatrice's life, and pulls off the most effective twist in the entire series. But beyond making one of the series' most antagonistic characters somewhat empathetic, Time Zero is a heartbreaking look at the ways trauma can echo across generations. As I mentioned, this episode explores Beatrice's dementia, which is an incredibly creative framing device. The events of Beatrice's life occur out of order, and scenes often cut back and forth through time. One moment, Beatrice is at her debutante ball, the next, she's back at home getting ready. Sometimes the reality of the present with her son Bojack sneak into these memories. Others, we're seeing Beatrice's battle with scarlet fever as a child. The important pieces of these memories come through clearly, while the less important details are sometimes not present at all. Nearly every non-important or background character is literally faceless. Some details are altered or changed based on our perception of those things at the time, like this opening sequence. sequence from Beatrice's childhood. The ladder of the slide that Beatrice climbs appears unbelievably tall, with dangerous crooks in the bars. This must have been how the ladder felt to Beatrice at that age, and so her reeling mind is adjusting her own memories to the reality of those emotions and fears. But while this is an incredibly interesting way to tell the story, it technically makes Beatrice an unreliable narrator. We can't be certain that what she remembers is truly accurate, because her recollection cannot be fully trusted. And while I do think they seem to mostly tell an accurate story, the important thing about these moments, even if they're altered or exaggerated in Beatrice's mind, is that this is how she herself feels about them. This is how they affected her, and it's how they've shaped Beatrice as a person and her worldview. So while we can't be 100% confident that these events necessarily played out exactly this way or not, we can be sure that Beatrice remembers them this way, and that can tell us a lot about Beatrice as a character. Time Zero in so many ways is a sequel to Season 4's other masterpiece, The Old Sugarman Place. And in order to fully understand Beatrice's trajectory, it's important to look back at the events of that episode. The devastating events of Beatrice's childhood in the 1940s had long-lasting effects on her development and her relationships. In 1944, Beatrice had a complete and loving family. Though Joseph was always abusive and problematic, Beatrice's mother and Crackerjack both shared a special bond with her. They truly cared for each other. By the following summer, Beatrice had lost both of those relationships and was left only with her father. Crackerjack's death in World War II devastated Honey, who was later lobotomized in her grief. There are some obvious ways that these events changed the course of Beatrice's development.
Promise me you'll never love anyone as much as I loved Crackerjack.
But there are some less obvious as well. Understandably, these events completely changed her views of her father Joseph and her relationship with him. In her late teens, after Beatrice returned from college, we see how the relationship has become more antagonistic.
She returned home with a bachelor's degree and a mouthful of waste.
While Beatrice humors many of her father's wishes, such as partaking in her own debutante ball,
Don't let her
doesn't
escape!
respect and views her lifestyle.
I'm only doing this for my father, who has very old-fashioned ideas about how a woman
Although seeing her mother become a lifeless husk of a person clearly had a part in leading Beatrice to this attitude. She wasn't willing to accept her father's death because she had already seen that complete, which is why somebody like Butterscotch Horseman ended up being so appealing to Beatrice.
Butterscotch Horseman, charmed, I'm sure.
This was a man who represented a lifestyle completely opposite. He didn't live a lavish life. In fact, he had only snuck into her debutante ball for the booze. He had big dreams of being a famous writer, and creativity clearly wasn't something Joseph Sugarman understood.
Have your morning coffee or tea with sugarmen and creamermen, but save some for these fellows.
Butterscotch was attracted to Beatrice as a person, yes, but he also appealed to Beatrice's desire to define his father.
You want me to leave my own party with you?
Beatrice's disappearance from her debutante ball, of course, only angered Joseph further, who demanded that Beatrice give her well-to-do suitor Corbin Creamerman another chance. This is an important event that changes Beatrice's perspective.
My feelings, other than what he expects me to do.
Corbin Creamerman represented her father's lifestyle, and therefore Corbin would have felt like a surrogate of her own father. She falsely expected anyone Joseph wanted her to be with to be an extension of his own life. And when she actually got to know Corbin a bit more, she realized that he experienced a lot of the same insecurities, and this was attractive to Beatrice. Of course, at this point, it was just barely too late.
It occurs to me that perhaps
After getting pregnant, Beatrice and Butterscotch eloped with big dreams of success on the West Coast.
wrote his great American novel.
While his wife took care of the baby.
But of course, nothing goes as planned. Butterscotch is ill-equipped to follow his writing dreams, and his failures slowly led Beatrice to fall back on some of the tendencies instilled in her by her father. She eventually shamed Butterscotch into taking a job at Sugarman West, giving them the more lavish lifestyle Beatrice was accustomed to. This led to Butterscotch resenting Beatrice, and he formed a relationship with their young maid, Henrietta, who eventually became pregnant with his child. We of course would later learn that this is Hollyhock. This leads to another heartbreaking event. After Butterscotch begs Beatrice to help him, she manipulates Henrietta into giving the baby up for adoption. This initially comes across as Beatrice's way of helping Butterscotch, but it ultimately ends up being portrayed as Beatrice feeling as though she's actually helping Henrietta.
Don't throw away your dreams for this job. Don't let that man poison your life the way he did mine.
Here's an interesting side note. Did you all ever notice that Butterscotch, Bojack, and Hollyhock all have the same nervous tick? Pretty cool detail. Beatrice clearly blames her unhappiness in her life on Butterscotch and Bojack, and she truly believes that she's saving Henrietta from a lifetime of her own unhappiness. And this attitude can all be traced back to Beatrice's childhood.
Hey, Los Angeles, how can you save 20% on your entire purchase at the redesigned Bed Bath & Beyond?
The final sequence of these flashbacks is beautifully haunting, and it all ties back to the moment the last of Beatrice's innocence was taken from her. Obviously, the events surrounding Cracker Jack's death and Honey's lobotomy played a major role, but following these events, Beatrice gets scarlet fever. In the old Sugarman place, we see three things bring Beatrice comfort: Cracker Jack, Honey, and her horse Baby Doll. Two of these three things are taken from her in the events of that episode, and in this one, the final is burned in front of her. This is obviously a play on the old story of the Velveteen Rabbit, but in Beatrice's case, the lack of empathy from her father in an incredibly trying period of her life was truly traumatic. Later in life, when Beatrice is confronted with the idea of aborting BoJack, she flashes back to the shot of her burning baby doll and decides she couldn't do it. Essentially, this childhood trauma is what led Beatrice into the life that she would later come to regret. And it's why this final sequence is so impressive. Each of the three events showcased on screen represent three different eras of Beatrice's life, and each event can be followed directly into the decision made in the subsequent event. Beatrice's baby doll is taken and burned in front of her. This trauma leads to Beatrice feeling the need to keep BoJack, which in turn leads to her overwhelming resentment of her life with her husband and son, and her forcing Henrietta into rejecting the life that Beatrice herself had, thus giving Hollyhock up for adoption. And this is just one example of the many ways generational trauma trickled down from Joseph all the way to the characters we know and love in BoJack Horseman. Tracking the aforementioned generational trauma is honestly pretty depressing, but the ways these traumas can leave lasting impacts spanning decades is important to explore. So let's take a look at this family tree of generational trauma caused by the Sugarman family. One thing we saw through Beatrice's childhood was an inordinate amount of importance placed on looks and weight. As a child, she wasn't allowed to eat pancakes or ice cream like her father or brother.
You can sprinkle some sugar on a lemon. That's a good healthy girl's snack.
This was clearly a societal issue, but one that was echoed and reinforced by people like Joseph to his wife and daughter. It clearly affected Beatrice long into her life in many ways. When we see her in her late teens, she asks her maid for a pretty pill, likely a weight loss supplement. In her dementia-riddled recollection of the late 90s, bringing BoJack a painting that belonged to Joseph, you can see that his fridge is full of sugar and lemons, which was the only treat she was allowed as a child. This showed that these ideas were internalized so deeply that it permeated her mind even in her old age. But the way this trauma trickled down generationally actually was with Hollyhock. In season 4, when Beatrice and Hollyhock are living with BoJack, Beatrice spikes Hollyhock's coffee with a chutney dog, another weight loss supplement, in addition to perpetually making mean comments about her weight throughout their time together.
You are so beautiful.
You could be thin too.
She not only psychologically attacked Hollyhock using the similar tactics that were used against her for her entire childhood, but she quite literally drugged Hollyhock to the point of overdose, which were of course the events that led to this episode. Another theme of this ongoing trauma is motherhood, and there's a lot of ways that this trauma showed itself. The most obvious is Honey Sugarman's lobotomy and Joseph Sugarman's general treatment of his wife. One of the most haunting moments is when Joseph chastises Honey after Beatrice gets scarlet fever.
It's a mother's duty to keep her children alive, and you are continually failing.
Joseph tells Honey she is continually failing at keeping her children alive, which is horrible for many reasons, but it even implies that it was Honey's fault that Cracker Jack died in the war. An insane accusation. It's also truly infuriating that he blames anything on Honey after he literally lobotomized her. But Joseph's actions left Beatrice motherless for the vast majority of her childhood, and it also led to Honey giving Beatrice this horrifying piece of advice.
Spotted trespasser! There!
This led to her general disdain for BoJack his entire life, which led him to seek out that validation elsewhere, like in comedy, where Beatrice also pushed that disdain for her own motherhood onto poor Henrietta, and in turn, Hollyhock. She cornered Henrietta into a situation where she was forced to give up her own child. Beatrice acted like she was doing this as a kindness, but it's clear that this was a manifestation of her own traumas continuing to affect her decision-making deep into her life. And while Hollyhock was ultimately raised by 8 great fathers, she still sought out her mother in her late teens, and based on the fact that Henrietta had also sought out Hollyhock, it was clear that she was never at peace with the arrangement that Beatrice forced her into. In addition to Beatrice's general disdain for BoJack, she instilled in him an unhealthy need to perform.
Nobody gives a damn what you feel. You got an audience out there, and they want to hear you sing.
This was passed down from Beatrice to BoJack, and then from BoJack to Sarah Lynn.
You don't stop dancing, and you don't stop smiling, and you give those people what they want.
The reaches of generational trauma extend even beyond family sometimes, to the other people we're close with. And sadly, we know how much Sarah Lynn internalized this. She didn't stop dancing, despite her true desires to become an architect, and the unhealthy coping mechanisms that Bojack and Sarah Lynn both partook in ultimately ended her life. And while we can't blame everything Bojack ever did wrong on generational trauma, because ultimately Bojack is a person that made his own decisions, it is interesting to think about how Bojack may have treated people differently if he had been raised differently. Throughout the series, Bojack has a general disregard for the feelings of the people he cares about. The events of Escape from LA were absolutely traumatizing to both Charlotte and especially Penny, and we see that they have lasting effects on Penny's psyche years later. We can't know for sure, but it's possible that this trauma could be passed down generationally as well.
I tried to throw it out, but I couldn't.
When people look at films that are super beloved, when they hear stories about the difficulties or tragedies that happen on set, they then go on to ascribe that production as cursed.
In the end, there is
Got her! Get here! Done! Over here! I'm on it! By the boat!